This is your 10-minute suspension setup guide. We're going to take you through setting the sag, rebound and compression damping, volume spaces, and give you some top tips. With so many knobs, dials and valves, it can be difficult to know where to start when you're setting up your suspension. So first, start with the sag. Setting sag is the first and most important suspension setup step. You need to get 25 to 30% sag on the fork and the shock under the weight of the rider and the bike. This keeps your wheels in contact with the ground because it allows them to extend into any holes and off any drops, and also allows the suspension to compress, again keeping the wheels in contact with the ground and giving you that all-important traction. Now the sag on this bike is already set, so we won't be doing that right now. If you want more information and an in-depth setup guide on how to set your sag, click the link here. The next thing to consider is how to set your rebound damping. Now this is safety critical, so it's really important to get it right. The rebound damping controls the speed at which the suspension recovers from bumps and how fast it reaches the sag point again. So it retards that movement of your suspension from compression to get back to the sag point. If the suspension rebounds too quickly, it can hamper your control on the bike. It can push on your arms or buck the back of the bike and mean the wheel even leaves the floor as the suspension extends. So you need the rebound slow enough. Conversely, if the rebound is too slow, then the bike will not return to the sag point quick enough and the suspension can pack down. And that means that the suspension will get progressively lower and lower with each hit and stiffer, and will mean again you lose control and lose comfort. Rebound is especially important to get right on the rear of the bike because if it's too fast, it can buck you and even push you over the handlebars, causing you to have a crash. So here you've got the rear rebound knob, exactly the same as the front, one way for slower towards the tortoise and one way towards the jackalope for faster. So this is a good example of what it looks like if the rebound on your fork is too fast. So it's pushing up really hard into my body and it feels really uncontrolled like a pogo stick, so we know we need to go a bit slower. This is what it looks like if the rebound damping is too slow. You've got too much rebound damping. So the suspension is returning really slowly, so it wouldn't react to bumps the way we wanted it to, and it's going to feel like the front end is very heavy every time we pull on the handlebars. Now I understand this is subjective, so it's all about feel. But what you want to feel with correct rebound setting is that the bike returns to the sag point in a controlled way, but quickly. So you want it to return to where it should be, but you don't want the bike pushing you or bucking you from the rear. That's the perfect rebound setting, and hopefully you will be able to feel exactly what that feels like when you're on the trail if you play around with those dials. My top tip, which is really important to remember when you're setting the rebound damping on your bike, is that the firmer the spring rate is, the more rebound damping you need. So a stiffer spring is going to put more force to return the suspension to the sag point, and you're going to need more rebound damping to match that stronger spring force. And conversely, if you have a lighter spring, you're going to need to wind off some rebound damping to make sure that it's not too slow. On more expensive high-end bikes, you might find that there is a separate low-speed and high-speed damping adjuster. Now the low-speed circuit, it doesn't refer to how fast the bike is going, it refers to how fast the suspension is moving. So low speed controls how much the bike pitches forward and back under braking and in a G-out and in the middle of a berm. So your low speed rebound, you want that to return nice and steadily, but you don't want it to be too firm, in which case the bike will feel quite wooden. The high speed rebound controls what the fork does deep in the stroke or when it's reacting from a high frequency hit, like braking bumps, for example. So you want your high speed rebound, which controls what your fork or shock does deep in the stroke when the spring rate is at its firmest. You want that to return in a nice controlled way that matches the spring rate, but you don't want it to extend too quickly, in which case it's going to buck you or push into your hands. So compression damping controls the rate at which the suspension can be compressed. So it provides some damping resistance as well as the resistance from the spring. Firstly, if you've got more basic suspension, there might be a dial like this one that says open, pedal and firm. So open means that the compression settings are set from the factory and they are as open as you can adjust them to be. Pedal is a light threshold on the low speed compression damping, and it just helps the suspension have a platform to push on if you're pedaling. And then firm means that the suspension platform, the low speed threshold, is as firm as you can set it on the fork and shock, which is great for going uphill, but probably too firm for going downhill. On some high-end forks and shocks, high and low speed compression are adjustable separately. So low speed compression damping controls those low frequency inputs to the suspension. So things like coming over a rise or into a compression or around a berm or up the face of a jump. So that's going to be controlled by your low speed compression. So you want the suspension to sink into its travel in a gradual way, just bleeding oil past that piston. So you need that set at a speed where the bike holds its shape when you're in a berm, so the front and the rear are matching, more on that later, but you want it fast enough that the bike doesn't feel wooden and it doesn't resist your movements and weight shifts. With high-speed compression damping, you want it as open as possible in order to absorb those high-frequency bumps and let the suspension and the wheels move out of the way of any hits, but you need it slow enough that your suspension doesn't just crash through the travel and bottom out. You need some resistance there. How do you know if you've got it right? Well, if the high-speed compression is too fast, you'll find yourself blowing through the travel and it's going to feel unsupportive and you're going to crash and bottom out in an uncontrolled way. If your high-speed compression damping is too much, it's too firm, you're going to probably get arm pump. The back of the bike's going to be skipping around when you hit the bumps and not absorbing them, even though you've got your sag set correctly. So any harshness, any firmness from the fork fighting the bike probably means too much high-speed compression damping and you want to wind that off a bit. If you have a full suspension bike, the front and rear suspension will need to be set up together. This is so the bike feels balanced. If one end of the bike is firmer or faster or softer and slower than the other end, it can lead to imbalanced handling. And imbalanced handling is going to feel weird on the trail and lead to strange handling characteristics. That's because the bike's dynamic geometry is affected by the suspension setup. The dynamic geometry is how the bike handles on the trail and how it feels as the suspension is moving whilst you're riding it. So you don't want to be pitched forward and you don't want to be pitched rearward, and you don't want to feel like the bike isn't working together. So the best way to get that set up is to follow the manufacturer's guidelines, or even better, to spend a day on the trails with a professional. But if you can't do that, here's our quick tips. If you're bouncing on the bike and one end of the bike feels stiffer and firmer or slower and softer, you're going to notice that even just riding around in the car park. I'm going to bounce on this bike, which is set up properly, and you should be able to see the suspension compressing and extending together. So on this bike, it's set up correctly, so you can see as a bunny hop, you can see that the bike is compressing and extending at roughly the same rate. A really useful tuning aid, if you've got air suspension, is volume spacers. Now, volume spacers literally just take up space inside the air chamber, making it smaller. Because it's smaller, the air pressure inside the chamber increases more quickly as you compress the suspension and makes it firmer towards the end of the stroke. Now, if your suspension is bottoming out and you've got your compression damping set correctly, you may be able to use volume spacers to stop it bottoming out and making it more controlled. So, how do you fit volume spacers? Well, let me take you through it. So firstly, undo the cap and let all the air out. Okay, next you want to take the top cap off your fork or the air can off your shock after you've let all the air out. So this is your air chamber, this is your top cap, and then you can get your volume spacers, which look like these, and you can thread them onto the bottom of the top cap like this. And then once they're tight, just put them back into the fork. Top tip, there will be a maximum number of volume spacers that you're allowed to put in your fork and shock without damaging it. So make sure you read the manufacturer's guidelines before you just throw loads in there.
So what would too many feel like?
So too many volume spacers would make your suspension feel very harsh, especially towards the end of the travel, even though you've got the sag set correctly and you've got your compression damping set correctly. So too many would stop you reaching full travel because your suspension is too progressive.
What about not enough?
Not enough, it would just be crashing through the suspension travel and you'd be bottoming out all the time, even though you had the sag set correctly and the compression damping set correctly. So that is how to set up your suspension, but let me give you one top tip before you go, which is maintenance. This isn't relevant if you've got a new bike because the suspension should already be maintained and properly lubricated, but if you're having any suspension setup issues involving it feeling stiff or sticky or not working the way you want, it might be worth thinking about getting that suspension serviced in order to make it work at its best. So always get your suspension properly maintained, stick to the manufacturer's service intervals. Apart from that, you might enjoy the next video by clicking here.